Well, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Kathy with Chicago Title.
I'm Ray.
And this is Liz.
And I'm Melissa.
She's our branch manager of the Cupertino office. So we're doing this kind of hybrid. There's people that are on Zoom and people that are here. So we're kind of going to go back and forth. If you have any questions, feel free to ask the questions. We're getting so many questions right now about FIRPTA. We've had several transactions and the buyer's agents asked why they should care because it's the seller, seller's the one that has to pay the FIRPTA if it's required. But many people don't understand that the buyer is the actual withholding agent, not the title company. And so we've had so many questions lately, so we decided to put a class together and go over what FIRPTA is so we can all better understand. So we have Melissa Palafox, we're gonna go ahead and take it away. And online on Zoom, if you guys have any questions, feel free to chime in. And we'll answer those as we go along.
Okay, there we go.
So what is FIRPTA? FIRPTA stands for the Foreign Investment of Real Property Tax Act. It's a federal statute that authorizes the federal government to tax foreign persons when they're transferring real estate located in the United States. IRS publication 515 defines FIRPTA as a withholding obligation under section 1445 generally imposed on the buyer. Yes, the buyer. When the U.S. real property interest is acquired from a foreign person. And you may ask, why is it the obligation of the buyer? Well, if you think about it, the seller is a foreign person, and if they sell real estate here in the U.S., most likely they'll take their money back to their home country and most likely not file a U.S. tax return. The federal government puts the FIRPTA withholding responsibility on the buyer to determine two things. Number one, whether or not withholding is required. Again, because the buyer is the one that owns the real estate once the deal has closed. If the FIRPTA is determined to be due and is not paid at closing, the IRS can record a lien against the buyer's newly acquired real estate. And in these cases, no, it is not something that is protected under their title insurance policy. Number two, the second thing the buyer is responsible for is if they decide the withholding is required, the amount of withholding is needed. So let's talk about the first part. How does the buyer determine if withholding is required? As shown in the car contract, the seller should be providing the buyer with the car form AS. On that form, they will indicate their residency status. As a listing agent or selling agent, it's crucial to be able to identify as early as possible if the withholding is required. The paperwork can be cumbersome and should be prepared by the buyer's CPA or a FIRPTA specialist. We will share with you some contact information on them shortly. Why do you ask? Because the penalties and charges that the IRS can impose for improper reporting, missing documentation, late reporting, incorrect forms is huge. So it's crucial that the documents be completed correctly. We like to say, don't mess with the IRS.
But it's not like, I'll tell you how scary this is. Like, usually like in the Bay Area, everything about 1 million, right? If everything about 1 million, that's 50%. So we had a case years ago. Like because the first time you have a time limit that you have to submit a check to the IRS. It's 20 or 21 days.
20 days.
20 days after closing. And before you turn it in, you have to check it very carefully. So we had a case like years ago, like when there were not so many foreign buyers, even our escrow officer, like probably have 1 or 2 cases a year. So nobody is that kind of familiar with that. So there's one of the cases like $6 million. The withholding of $6 million, 15% is 1 million. So there was the last day, one of our escrow officer was holding a $1 million check. She was crying because she missed the last FedEx. Think about like $1 million.
So even though you withhold the correct amount, from the seller's funds, the penalty is on top of that $1 million. So huge.
If it's not there on time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have
do they?
So how does the buyer know? How do they know? So this is one of Chicago Title's forms that we ask that the seller complete under penalty of perjury, their non-foreign status. If the seller is able to complete the fields on CAR Form AS or complete our certification of non-foreign status that we provide, or your other title companies, hopefully it's Chicago Title, and sign it under penalty of perjury, then we're good. No withholding is required. If the seller is not able to complete this form because it does not apply, or they complete it with information showing they are non-resident, then withholding may apply. Again, it is so crucial that this information be identified as early as possible in the transaction. It's important that you, as realtors, no matter which side you're representing, address the issue at the consummation of the contract, if you are the selling agent, or at the time that you take the listing, if you are the listing agent. The earlier we can address the FIRPTA questions, the smoother the transaction will progress.
So I'm gonna add into that one, we had just recently had a transaction, and the buyer's agent wasn't aware it's the buyer's responsibility. So then when they found out it was the buyer's responsibility, the selling broker and the seller did not want to withhold the FIRPTA. But they needed to, so they had an attorney, they went back and forth with the attorney said, no, let us be the withholding agent. Well, they're not part of the transaction, so they can't be the withholding agent on behalf of the buyer, the seller's attorney. So finally, they were going back and forth, neither one agreed, so the transaction got delayed about 2 weeks, and then finally, the attorney for the seller said, go ahead and withhold the FIRPTA. So we withheld the FIRPTA and we're able to close the transaction, but it is something that has to be agreed upon. If your buyer's not comfortable with what the seller is providing, sometimes it can delay a transaction. So it's really good to address this upfront, have all the information that's needed, so it's not a delay.
I want to add too, it's also very important to, as an agent, to educate both sides. And I had experienced a case, like, they didn't aware of it. And all of a sudden, buyer realized, oh, it's my responsibility. If I didn't do it correctly, they're gonna put a lien on my house, fire like freak out. So, actually, we as escrow, we actually step in a little bit, provide some of the education, tell them, this is a step, if you do it correctly, you're fine. But, we could make it, this could be a little more, smoother if the buyer has the knowledge, the agent has, provide a flyer right here. Write to them, give them a little bit of knowledge, don't be scared, if you follow the steps, you'll be fine.
I have a transaction that, it happened in May, and the seller and her son is selling, the mom is the owner. And they're in a three-way, like a trust or something like that, and he sold the property, I asked him for the FIRPTA, he wouldn't give it to me, he says, I'll get it to you, and it closed, and we never got it, and to this day, we still don't have it, so what happens then? It's a rental property that they sold, it's a duplex in Campbell.
If they don't pay, if the seller doesn't pay that FIRPTA and it's owed,
I don't think that it's owed because they're not a foreign.
then it's, yeah, if they're not.
So it's okay.
Fine, yeah.
It's if they're citizens of the US and they live in Frazzled.
I was in a meeting a couple of weeks ago and I had an agent come up to me and it was a different title company, I don't know who had handled it. But FIRPTA was not withheld for whatever reason, should have been withheld. Buyer received $150,000 lien on their property. They went to the county and they're like, unfortunately, you're responsible for this.
Can we go
Because the
back
seller didn't,
to
the
get
seller,
to pay?
I guess they can
Why?
try, but they're out of the country. Out of the country, but title doesn't.
Title insurance does not cover it.
Not covered that.
So they have to hire an attorney and go after the seller if they can even reach them.
Right.
Because again, they're foreign, they're most likely in their home country, unattainable.
Not paying taxes. Right.
Yeah.
So it's really important if you're a buyer's agent to make sure your buyers have all the ducks in a row, so there's no liability on them and have that bill come back to them. That's a big expense.
And a lot of times we have first-time buyers and they're unaware of this process. Some realtors aren't even familiar that it's the buyer's responsibility. We've seen it all.
And in this area, lots of FIRPTA.
Yeah.
Our escrow officers are very experienced because we handle lots of FIRPTA.
So they have to withhold if they're foreigners, it's not US citizens. If they got a permanent resident, is that still considered?
We'll come up.
Okay, but we're saying that if.
It's
they are-
an-
And they have to have 3.3 withheld, right? 3.3.
That's different.
We'll come up to the percentages in just a moment. I got a couple of slides to share with you. Keep in mind that it is the buyer who is responsible for the withholding. Again, the property will be liened by the IRS if withholding is not completed. Seller is back in their home country, again, like I mentioned, spending the money made on the real estate property investment, and the IRS wants their share. We, as the title company or settlement agent, are only considered the settlement agent in the case of federal FIRPTA. It is 100% the responsibility of the buyer to determine the two things we spoke about. One, whether or not withholding is required, and two, how much the withholding should be. So who is a foreign person? For purposes of FIRPTA, a foreign person is defined as a non-resident alien individual, a foreign corporation, a foreign partnership, foreign trust, or foreign estate. Who is a resident alien? A resident alien is a permanent resident of the US who has a US issued resident alien card or permanent resident card and US tax-paying identification number. Now, as you mentioned, how much is withholding? So you mentioned 3.33%, that's state withholding. So that goes to the Franchise Tax Board. Federal goes to the IRS, and it's determined on this chart here. So intended residence, is the buyer going to reside at the property? Yes or no? So then you go over to the next column. Is the property sales price $300,000 or less? In this area, we don't see $300,000 or less. If it's under $300,000, they could be exempt if the buyer was holding it as their primary residence. If not, it jumps up to 15% of that sales price. Over to the next column, is the sales price greater than 300,000 but not over 1 million? It can qualify as 10% or 15%, and over 1 million, which most of the properties in our area is, it goes up to 15% for both resident or non-resident of the buyer.
15%.
How much?
Or is that
15%.
at 50%?
At 15%. So how much should be withheld? Just as I mentioned, you should always refer to the customers and have their own tax advisor or CPA confirm those amounts. Again, we don't advise them on what it should be. My clients that come, I normally just gauge them at the 15% because I don't know whether or not the buyer is going to be living at the property or not. I don't do my own taxes, so again, if you don't do your own taxes, don't give them tax advice.
Tax advice ever.
Exactly. A good reference is the IRS publication 515, and of course, a tax professional. Exemptions. We get a lot of questions about exemptions. The biggest exemption is that the seller is not a foreign person. There are some other exemptions listed here, most of which do not apply, such as the sales price not more than 300,000, because we don't see those properties here nowadays. The exemptions above or here always can be reviewed with their CPA, tax attorney, or FIRPTA specialist. What forms? Lots and lots of forms. So we will always direct you to the IRS website to make sure that the current forms are being used. Since we're going into 2024, the tax forms could be changing. Assuming it's determined that FIRPTA's withholding is required, let's talk about the forms. We will close, when we close escrow, the forms listed here need to be provided to us in advance of closing. These forms, again, should be completed by their tax advisor or one of the FIRPTA specialists that we will share with you shortly. It's imperative that the buyer and sellers share their tax ID numbers. Both seller and buyer need to be aware of their tax ID numbers. Again, we're in a day and age of fraud, and a lot of clients push back and say, I don't want my socials to be shared with the seller. Again, it's tax purposes. So if the buyer doesn't want to lien on their property, they're gonna wanna acquire the seller's identification numbers, and the buyer's gonna wanna give them theirs, because these tax forms go down to both socials on the forms. And if there's any issues, if the seller goes to file a tax return, they need to file it under their social, but they're gonna need the buyers to identify the forms that were sent down to the IRS. If the seller does not have a tax ID number, have them apply for one as soon as possible. Yes,
So has there been any case where you have two sellers and one seller is a resident and the other one is a?
yes.
So in that case, how would you go about it?
So I've had CPAs tell that one that's a non-resident, that they file based on 50% or their portion of the interest of the property. So again, we don't advise them on what to do. We have them seek the support from their CPA or tax advisor. And in that scenario, they did 50% of the sales price, and we sent that into the IRS.
Okay. And in that case, will all those participants write on their own forms, or it's?
So it's individuals. So the one that's the non-foreign would complete the individual forms, and one buyer would complete the individual forms based on that one seller.
Okay, got it.
So the tax ID is needed, especially if a seller goes to file their income taxes. They need to make sure that it coincides with what we send to the IRS on these tax forms. It helps the IRS identify the returns and get their credit applied easier. As we mentioned, we got some FIRPTA specialists. Up here, you'll see a few states: Arizona, Florida, Texas, and Nevada. You may ask, where's California? Again, this is a federal situation, so it doesn't require the specialist to be located within the state of California.
It's nationwide.
It is nationwide.
It's important to be able to refer to your clients.
And yes, there is a fee that they charge, similar to tax preparation cost. It is generally viewed as a deductible item. However, check with your CPA on getting that information confirmed. And again, if you're representing, turn it back.
Yeah.
If you're representing the buyer, again, it's the buyer's responsibility. We want to make sure the buyer has the assurance that they need, that the seller's a non-foreign resident or non-foreign status. So the buyer is going to want to be the one that's going to reach out to the specialist to confirm.
Everybody take a picture? Okay.
And we can always share that information with you too. Sometimes that information updates on a readily basis, so we can always give you a current one. So that is FIRPTA in a nutshell. If you have any takeaways, the biggest one to address is the residency status ahead of time. Make sure escrow knows, make sure you disclose that in your disclosure package to the new buyers. Make sure that when you are representing a buyer and you take on the disclosure package, see if the sellers filled out that CAR form AS. Anybody have any questions? No? Any other stories you want to share?
I want to add, we just recently had one where the withholding was done. Documents were sent off to the IRS. The buyer received a bill for the FIRPTA that it wasn't paid. And so luckily, you know, we facilitate mailing, sending the papers off, we keep documentation, copies of the checks and everything. Buyer came back to us. One of our escrow officers, 4 hours later, working back and forth with the IRS, was able to get it resolved, but they misplaced the check, separated it from the letter, and then we had to help them identify to get that check credited to that account, so it wasn't, and then it was removed. But that's why it's really important to have that. We have the paperwork and are handling that on behalf, so that was taken care of.
Yeah, even though we send the check, the tax forms, all in one envelope, as soon as the IRS receives it, there's a department that processes a check, there's a department that processes 8821, there's a department that processes 8288A. So all three of them need to coincide. And if this check doesn't identify these forms over here, there's a lapse in time, and so they'll send out that bill due notice to the buyer, or sometimes the seller will receive it. So some of those forms, again, like Kathy was mentioning, once the IRS receives it, if any of those boxes are incomplete, the tax check does not get processed. So then again, that notice to the buyer or the seller may go out. And once they receive it, if I receive a bill notice saying 150,000 is due on my new property, I'm gonna go crazy.
So we do have a checks and balance in place for its incomplete documentation, and we will send it to our,
We have an advisory department that double checks, makes sure the boxes are complete, that the numbers make sense. However, we don't confirm the information. We don't make sure that the seller's social is the seller's. We don't confirm the buyer's social is the buyer's, but we go based on the buyer's information that they've completed those forms and submitted them to us. Either the buyer completes it, the buyer's CPA completes it, or the buyer's tax professional.
Yeah, I wanna add a little bit, the importance, why you need a good CPA. First is to answer, is the seller foreign or not foreign? It's actually from a tax point of view. So CPA is the best person to tell you, right, if it's foreign. Actually, besides your citizenship, besides your green card, some H-1B, they also fall in the category of a resident alien, it's a tax purpose. So first, CPA can tell them foreign or not foreign. Second, during the transaction, those tax form, the buyer and seller, they have a lot of questions and they come to you or us to ask. We can't also fill out the numbers, so they can fill out. And beside that, after closing is also very important. Can you go back to the slide where on the form? So
The identifications or the forms?
the forms. With the 88, 28, you passed it, I think.
Yeah.
Passed it, too fast. So what happened to the form? Look at the middle of one, the form 80 to 88, copy A and B. So after IRS receive those forms, they will stamp the copy B and mail it back to the seller. So we actually had a case like seller come back to us, how come I didn't get my refund? What happened? So after hours of like communication, so IRS told us, hey, we mailed you the copy B, the stamped one. When the next year, when you file your tax return, you need to turn that in. So at that point, the seller find out, oh, we actually received it, my son got it, he didn't know what is that, put it in the drawer. That's why it didn't turn in. That's why you need a good CPA. If you have a good CPA, especially some of the case like foreign seller, they don't have a good mailing address, right? The CPA can help them, right?
Yeah, I've had CPAs put their mailing address on those forms, so then the CPA actually gets the copy B form.
use it
Yeah.
for their taxes when I help.
You don't want your seller calling you, say, hey, I didn't get it, because we have heard a case, it delayed 2 years, they still couldn't get it back.
Do you guys have good referrals for references for referrals for CPA?
FIRPTA specialist, one of the slides.
Those are FIRPTA specialists. They'll help guide your clients on completing the forms. They do charge a small fee, but
Are they the CPAs too?
Yes.
they are.
Like they are all CPAs, okay. I don't see any in California, do you?
So it doesn't have to be in California because it's a federal statute.
I'm sure there's plenty in California that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can check with any CPA locally and they can give you, especially if they work with your client, they can give them the tax advice that they're looking for.
And some of the seller, like, don't even have the social security number, right, IT number, so it's also important to have a good CPA you can refer.
Hello, we have a question in chat box. Does the buyer withhold the tax and send to IRS?
The buyer acts as the withholding agent. The funds are actually withheld in escrow from the seller's proceeds. So we collect all the tax forms that the buyer provides to us, given that the seller and the buyer have come to a mutual agreed amount.
And then we submit it to the IRS.
Yeah.
As part of the escrow.
And again, we save a copy of all those forms that we submit. We provide a copy package to the seller and the buyer at the close of escrow, so they have that to go and file their taxes in the next tax year.
Anybody else have any questions on FIRPTA?
Questions? So, when you're talking about seller's proceeds, is that before they pay for the agent fees or after?
It's part of all the closing costs. So there's a line item, 15%, 10% to the IRS. We put that in there.
Okay,
Off the sales price.
thank you.
Any other questions online? Now that we have your attention, let's talk about wire fraud and business email compromise. For those of you that have been in the business for a while, know that when the market contracts, we see some interesting things going on. For those of you that might not be new to real estate and loans, some of these interesting things may seem unfamiliar, even bizarre. And of course, it goes hand in hand with business email compromise. Fraudsters are building profiles on each and every one of us with the information that we share on social media and things that we find or even pay money on for in the dark web. With the information they are able to gather, they are able to infiltrate email accounts, guessing passwords, and lying in wait to see when you have a real estate transaction pending. They set up rules in your email and auto delete messages or auto forward, and then they pretend to be you. Pretend to be the escrow officer or any other party to the transaction using a spoofed email. These spoofed emails often will replace an L with a 1 or an 0 with an O and use the email or Yahoo as the email address. Easy for someone to miss or not notice. Then they replace the wire instructions with their own and bam, wire funds get sent to the fraudster's account and goes on and on. So we've had several situations that we've heard about where email addresses get compromised. If you hover over the email address, it'll show you the actual email address that it's coming from. So always make sure that you are familiar with who you're dealing with. If your email comes in or you have a client that says, I just received an email that says that the wire instructions have been changed, our wire instructions do not change, will not change ever.
We're seeing, and this is happening a lot. You think, oh, it's not happening. It's happening multiple times a week throughout the entire county. The industry is really being attacked right now. And I saw one that somebody had sent to me and the email address was correct. It was, whatever at, ctt.com. When you clicked on it, then it said the escrow officer's name at oclosings.com. But when it was written, it looked correct. So you have to really don't hit reply all. Look at the email, click on the email, see what it says, because
but even if you do a reply all, it'll pull in the correct email address. And if you notice that that's not correct, stop right there.
Yep.
Contact your escrow team, find out what's going on. Or it could be a loan agent. It could be anybody that says that jumps into the
multiple parties,
transaction.
yeah.
Whoever they were able to infiltrate, they'll jump in there and try and pose as that person.
That has happened to me.
Yeah.
But luckily the catches, gotta catch it within 24 hours, otherwise the money's gone.
Yeah, and sometimes within 24 hours, the money's gone.
Exactly. Sometimes, yeah, within those first 24 hours, yes, it is crucial. However, sometimes the funds get dispersed right away and the funds are gone.
Does that happen? You found?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Oh, yeah, many times. That's what we're looking at the numbers, $10.3 billion victim losses in 2022. 2021 was 6.9 billion. Look at how much it's jumped.
I think it's mostly coming from like Russia or Korea,
They're all
It's all over. It's in the US.
That's what I said. If these people get up, get dressed up, go to work, sit in an office and just hack all day long, hoping to try to get some money somewhere, and they do. They do.
Once you send your funds to criminal's account, usually they'll split instantly to multiple smaller wire all around the world and cash out. So if you don't catch it in 24 hours, it's gone.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they're targeting earnest money deposits, funds to close, payoffs. We've received spoofed payoffs, changing the wire instructions.
Coming
So-
from escrow, our
Like,
real
so-
estate companies going after the commissions, kind of crazy, spooked ones, yeah.
Yeah, so a commission demand could come in and they could say, here's a revised commission demand, and then we notice the wire instructions have been changed. So we're always double checking and making sure and confirming before we send any funds that the wire instructions we received are correct.
So any revised stuff, you pick up the phone and call that escrow
Absolutely.
officer.
Correct. We always have verified wire instructions before we close.
And not always the phone number on the letter or the email that you received, know the cut number and call directly.
Yeah, we use a trusted phone number that was either provided to us at the onset of the transaction, or since we received communication during the course of the transaction, we make sure that it was the correct number, that we were talking to the correct person. Next, so if you're not familiar with our Start in Here platform, we do have that app available, and it's a secured platform where we are provided the trusted phone numbers of all parties, valid email addresses for all parties, and it's a place where we can communicate, provide documentation. The sellers and the buyers complete our online questionnaire package at the onset of the transaction, and it's a great portal for you to get the final statements, your broker packages, home warranty invoices. It's exactly documents that we have in the course of the transaction are located there.
And it's just like now, the banks have their own portal, you can use the app or you can log in online for this. Everything's all in one place, and we are happy to say, since we've been starting this portal, if the clients are interacting within the portal, we have 0 instances of fraud. We did have an instance where we've been interacting with the client back and forth through the portal, they were using everything, they got an email
Outside of the portal.
I got an email, said, we need, things have changed, we're moving up the closing, we need to get your funds ASAP, here's our wiring instructions, please send it before 5. The guy panicked that wiring instructions were fraudulent to an LLC, not Chicago Title, and he wired the funds outside of the instructions we already provided inside the portal. So that's something we can't really control, but if you're communicating with your clients, let them know this secure portal is for their safety, their important information safety, for your safety as a real estate agent, because you have access to the portal and you're not going to be receiving any wire instructions from us via email.
It's located here in the portal. So if you have buyers that are looking for wire instructions, say you should be receiving an email from your escrow team. You're going to receive a Start in Here login. They're going to go in there. It's a short video that they watch. There's a documentation wire safe that they acknowledge, and it has our wire instructions and instructions that they will not be receiving any additional wire information from us. They will not be receiving change of wire information from us. So it's a great start for your clients.
And we're even wary of, having agents email us and say, can you send us the wire instructions so we can send it to our client? That is the key time.
That's where the fraudsters jump in.
Between those emails and it gets hacked. So we don't send wire instructions.
As soon as fraudsters see the word wire, they jump in.
They're monitoring.
They're monitoring emails. They're monitoring keywords. Congratulations on going into contract. Wire instructions. Earnest money deposit. Those are keywords that they're looking to factor in and try and spoof you from moving forward.
Words for earnest money deposit?
EMD.
EMD. Earnest money.
Okay, so you
Yeah.
can do that.
But they would probably have that on their radar too.
Exactly.
They're so smart.
Right?
Right?
Look at it, your email in the wire instruction is actually a protection for the agent. There,
Encrypted,
a couple of years ago, they actually had a case, the email had, the buyer lost their money. So after that, they sued everybody on the email chain. So it's actually a protection for the agent. Don't touch the wire instruction. Don't send it.
Don't be responsible
Yeah.
to send the wire instructions to your client. Have escrow send it directly to them, being a secured method. I can't speak on behalf of the other title companies, but this is what Chicago Title does to protect the clients.
Has to from us to the client, direct.
Direct link through a secured
Nobody-
portal.
Yeah.
Save everybody's money.
Exactly.
Right? Cause how sad is that on the, several that have happened, these are their whole savings,
Yeah.
just wired somewhere. What the percentage of getting the money back is small, it's not hot. And
So
so
what
that's
happens to the deal?
they don't close.
They don't close.
They don't close
Get the money
because it
back,
could
yeah.
be the buyer's only funds that they had to transfer to us.
So it's the buyer's loss.
Yeah.
So it's the buyer that needs to do it.
Very careful.
Any questions?
Anybody online have any questions? And again, we are always available, and here to help.
And whether we're discussing FRIPTA or wire fraud, just know you're never alone. We're always here to help. Always here. Questions, your clients, just let us know.
All right, well, thank you so much. Thanks for being online as well.
Thank
And
you.
again, Paul, if you have any questions, we'll leave some of these handouts for those of you that are online that they'll have them here, or just shoot us an email. And we will send those over to you as well, so you have them for your clients. Good thing to put in your, listening packages.
Yes, thank you again.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Is this your normal class? When you guys have these?
Huh?
Is this your normal class?
No, usually they're normally on Zoom, we get a big.
That's better.
They're trying to get